Okay, thanks. Can I get your attention? So, welcome to this IHRR Seminar. We're delighted today to be hosting Professor Andrew Collins from Northumbria University. Andrew is Professor in Disaster and Development and the leader of the Disaster and Development Network, which he launched in 2013. He joined the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at Northumbria in 1997, and quickly, very quickly I think you'll note, established the world's first disaster management and sustainable development postgraduate program there in 2000. So that was a very busy 3 years setting up, I imagine. His research focuses on the conceptual, methodological and policy aspects of disaster reduction, health ecology, sustainable development, adaptive capacity and human security in contexts of crises. As such, he advocates addressing hazard, risk, disaster and complex emergency and humanitarianism in an interdisciplinary manner. So the types of discussions that we've been having over recent weeks around resilience, around interdisciplinary working, these kind of things, and the types of discussions that many of you are interested in across your masters in terms of risk. He's published a wealth of work in this field, or across these various different fields, I should say, including the monograph Disaster and Development, and his work has seen him take up a number of influential positions on committees, including the UK government and the WHO. So today he's going to be speaking, as it says here, on advancing disaster and conflict risk reduction. So over to you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much to the IHRR for the invite to speak here. If anything doesn't sound too good on the sound with my microphone, let me know straight away, okay? Right, so I've chosen this topic specifically because I feel it's a topic which is examined, underexplored, and for which we need to focus our attentions a lot more. So the work I've been involved with over a good number of years now is commonly called disaster risk reduction. It's actually just a derivative in my mind of what we call disaster and development studies, and this has become quite well established at the global level. However, what I want to do today is see if there's a way we can perhaps move a little bit forward from the current progress we've made in getting a global agreement to reduce the risk of disasters to be something a bit more proactive, something which is likely to be implementable. And in asking the question about how can we push the paradigm forward and how can we make it more effective in policy and practice, we seem to be arriving at a similar sort of question. What is the link with conflict risk reduction? So that's why I've arrived at this title. And I've given this talk in part only once before in Freetown, Sierra Leone, just over a year ago, which is a conflict context, or former, what we call post-conflict area. Okay, so click, this one. There we go. So the introduction's already been done, so that's just to sort of flag the network, and I have a number of other affiliations. But the overview of the talk is in 3 parts. I want to start by just talking about the actuality of disaster and conflict risk, why we want to look at the two things together. And the second part of the talk is about perspectives that are common to disaster risk reduction and conflict risk reduction. Now there's probably many, but I've selected 3 in particular. Okay, so they're early warning, a rights-based approach, and resilience to disaster and conflict. So those 3. So we're going to be looking at those in some detail. And the third part, and I promised myself today to not leave that last part to a little sort of 2-minute rush at the end, but enough time to actually look at this in a bit of detail, is some of the systematics for advancing disaster and conflict risk reduction. Now, an acronym DCRR, it's convenient, it's one you won't find all over the literature yet. Maybe it will be. If it doesn't matter. we know whenever you see that through this presentation, what we're talking about is combined conflict risk reduction, so conflict disasters and other forms of disaster. So just to clarify that right from the start, if you see DCRR, it's conflict and other types of disasters. So conflict is a disaster, major conflicts, and we're talking about, generally speaking, extreme emergencies. Okay. However, as in all development and disaster studies or disaster and development studies, we're also interested in the everyday life and how it's those underlying influences which actually lead to major crises in the longer term. And the way we respond to a major crisis is through trying to rebuild development processes, okay, to recreate normal life. So you can never separate the two. However, the learning from this particular presentation is probably more around the extreme type of environments. Okay, so that's quite a bit about the overview, and the good news is I'll be able to come back to some of these summative sort of points as we move through the rest of this. So on the actuality of disaster and conflict risk, the reason, the immediate reason for wanting to look at the two together is that you'll find, in fact, environmental disasters and economic disasters, social disasters, are happening very often in the same places as where there is conflict, intercommunal strifes or open warfare. So it would be an obvious reason, I suppose, why you would want to look at the two. They're happening in the same place. And funny enough, the people who have to respond, if you think about it, to these emergencies are often the same people. They're the same agencies. The same emergency managers are having to deal with these different types of crises. Now, there is a good report being done on what the links are, and I'm not just going to try to repeat that today. If you go to the Overseas Development Institute 2013, there's a nice sort of summative sort of review there of all the different ways that conflict and other types of disasters are happening in the same sort of location. So that's what I would say is the actuality of disaster and conflict risk, how they sit together. What I want to try to do, though, is, and of course the third point, that conflict casualties often dwarf all the other types of disasters going on. So usually it's health and conflict are the ones which produce the large numbers. Not always. But this is not really about a numbers game. It's saying that conflict is actually a process which can produce other types of vulnerabilities which then you succumb to more readily. Okay, so part of disaster risk reduction is about avoiding hazards, it's about reducing your exposure to hazards, and the other big part of it is about reducing your vulnerability, your socioeconomic vulnerability, or even your biological susceptibility. So if you're nutritionally compromised, you are more susceptible to an infectious disease. If you are living in the poorest neighborhood on the edge of town, you may well be more likely to be in lower lying land, which is more prone to flooding. This is typically what we mean by exposure, vulnerability, and sometimes it's more about who you are, and that correlates with where you have to be as well. Okay, so what I'm trying to build towards is what you saw on that third point, really, about what are the ways in which we can understand the systematics in this equation to be able to implement strategies which are going to be effective. So what do I mean by implement strategies? Well, a lot of the ideological battle we've had over the last 20 years or so about trying to understand what is a disaster, what are the causes of disaster, what's the best way of mitigating them, reducing disaster risk and so forth, we've made huge progress. We've sort of won the ideological battle in many ways. I can remember 15 years ago, it was quite rare to find people able to really communicate about sustainable development ambitions in the same sentence as reducing the risk of a disaster, typically an environmental disaster. These were sort of emerging as two separate areas. We're well beyond that now. We have global agreements. This is the emergence of the International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, which has arrived at the current Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction that I'm sure most of you are aware of. And the aims of that: the substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods and health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities and countries. There's that's an outcome and a goal. There's another set of details that follow that, and you can read all about it. The point is to remind ourselves that we have a policy environment which is rearing to go. We have signatories around the world to doing disaster risk reduction, and we also have it now increasingly being sort of recognized within the Sustainable Development Goals. So the idea that these are separate areas is gradually fading away, and we've just got one agenda of basically trying to reduce risks of catastrophes, be they development induced, be they environmentally climate induced, be they other induced. So this is where conflict is usually the missing ingredient in most of these agendas. So I think it's time to put conflict right back into the center stage of this to take it forward. And the reason is that we're running short within these strategies, particularly the disaster risk reduction strategy, I would say. We're running short of implementable strategies, practical things to do to really make an impact. So I said already, perhaps we've made big progress ideologically. We've won that battle. The policy world is now speaking a sensible sort of language, but yet how are we going to reach these targets? By 2030, we have to have made big progress. So we need to look for, sometimes we call this the low-hanging fruit, those things we could do to be more effective. So what I want to now start to do, therefore, is see what we can say about this fact that conflict always seems to be part of the equation somewhere. You may want to challenge this and say, well, no, I can think of examples of major catastrophes and crises which don't have anything to do with conflict. Fine. Useful exercise to try and find those ones which are not related to conflict, but I'd invite you to think of conflict in quite a broad range of different types of conflict. People not getting on with each other. It's not always about the barrel of the gun. So where can cooperation, alliance building, for example, and these sorts of activities really make a difference is also part of, I think, conflict risk reduction. So we live in an increasingly competitive world, and you know, if you weigh it's creating conflicts. This is what I mean by look at it in a mass emergency type of situation. If we take cast our minds over to somewhere like the Yemen just now, where there's open conflict, parts of the Middle East, and actually there are plenty of conflicts going on in the world at local level, military-style conflicts. But you know, think of it as a spectrum right through to more subtle type of competitions between people that are actually not moving us in the direction of sustainable development or reducing the risk of crises. So here we start to unpack the equation a little bit by saying, well, where does conflict sit with sustainability perspectives? So this framework I've been using for some years, but I've expanded it here. It's adapted from, it's now put in a line at the bottom which says emphasizing sustainable conflict risk reduction. And the row just above that is the relationship of sustainability issues to disasters. And it's a way of saying, well, we need to start looking at the different emphases there might be. So some of the themes are listed along the bottom. So if you are thinking in terms of environmental sustainability, then some of the language would be environmental security, access issues. Environmental justice is quite an expanding field just now. If you are, talking of more sort of people-centered or socially driven type of sustainable development, then your focus might be more on peace building, trust building, cooperation, societal well-being, and then there's the economic, or perhaps I should say political economic sort of perspective in the right-hand corner there, mutually assured survival of nation states and economies through reducing conflict. So they are interrelated, and speeding up a little bit now, and I will do this whenever I feel we're getting a bit behind. So this is quite straightforward, and it just says that there is, in this actuality of disaster and conflict risk, it's a systems approach we can consider. Systems rapidly become complex, so if we just start with something straightforward, like there's a relationship between poverty and environmental degradation. It's been empirically proven in many case studies that people have done around the world that where there's more poverty, you get often more immediate pressure on environments. Not always, maybe it's population and environment. And it can work both ways, so it's a cycle. But, this is a sort of typical deterministic, Malthusian type of sort of view of the world. This relationship does exist, but does it really explain things sufficiently? And if it doesn't, then we need to get a little bit more sophisticated, and we end up with something like this, which is an integrated poverty and environment system. But I'll put this old diagram, but I think highly current diagram, up into to really show the situatedness of conflict in this particular case. There's many ways you could design that, but that tries to show you some of the linkages. And you turn it on its head into what would be a virtuous spiral, and these therefore become the aspirational things you want to do. So you can start anywhere. We can start with conflict mitigation, and by doing that we are addressing issues of environmental change. If we were to start over here, that was all about marginalization. If we go for inclusion and reducing vulnerability, then arguably this is going to link to all the other things. The sort of thing. This is a full integrated sort of view of the way the world really works. It's open to lots of possibilities for intervention. Another sort of set of three simplified sort of things now then: individual behavior, the political will, and having the research, the science and technology are the three things which crop up repeatedly in this sort of now simplified equation, and we get disaster and conflict risk reduction as a sort of key area in that. And going on, you can go back over these and sort of ponder over them if you want to later on. This one here, not used nearly so much, but this now tries to expand it out. And also apologies to anyone who was attending the conference just last semester, last term, and I used a little bit of this material there as well. So it's sort of can be used in a lot of disaster and development studies or disaster risk reduction type of context. But I think here it's highly relevant to this focus today on disaster and conflict risk reduction. What you have at the bottom here is the three areas I just mentioned before: the power relations, the structures, if you like, the politics and the political will sits here. The research, the technology, the education is going to be essential to achieving disaster risk reduction as well. And ultimately we've always got the big obstacle of can we change people's behavior sufficiently. So it's structure for the sociologists in the room, it's structure and agency together. It's not just one or the other. And thanks to people like Anthony Giddens, we have a structurationism type of approach, which is the interaction of the two in any case. That's down there, but this is trying to say we have to understand the sort of cultures within which this is happening, the way we understand things, and this is what I would see as pushing the boundaries further, and maybe there's some secrets in there where we can start to address new ways of making progress in this field. This next slide, therefore, talks in a bit more detail, I suppose, about the challenge of understanding the systems and the meaning of disaster and conflict risk reduction together. Now, this same slide could be used to think about disaster risk reduction in its more established form. It could be similarly used to think about conflict risk reduction, but maybe actually by putting disaster and conflict risk reduction together, we are more able to respond to these words that appear here, which admittedly are difficult to separate between which one's a meaning, which one's a social relationship, and hence a sort of added line down the middle there. So these are some of the challenging sort of areas, but the quite exciting areas, because in a way, if we've got to the point we've won the ideological battle, but now we're just talking about how to really make disaster risk reduction happen for even as part of sustainable development goals and other aspirations, if you want, world peace and so forth, then these are the sorts of things we really need to understand quite seriously and to really get involved into the subject area, and they haven't been there sufficiently, not in a coordinated sort of way. So that is a lot of concept to take on board in just 20 odd minutes. So I'll put a little summary there of what I've actually said, is something hopefully reasonably straightforward to communicate. It just says that disaster and conflict risk reduction are necessarily interrelated objectives. You can't really do one without the other in most settings. There's even conflict between some aid agencies, if you want to think about that. In responding to disasters, we have conflicts in terms of different viewpoints. Again, you can go look at perhaps where those relationships sit. Can we get peace building from a major disaster is an interesting area to look at. If we invest in peace building, is that going to reduce the risk of environmental disasters? So those relationships can be explored, but ultimately I think we can safely say that these are interrelated objectives conceptually, in terms of policy, and also in terms of practice very often. The second point, to sum up, is that there's complex processes that underlie disaster and conflict risk. It's not going to be any simple relationship. It's useful to try and think what the correlation is between the two, but ultimately there's a lot of different things going on there. And then the third point, understanding disaster and conflict risk widens the possibility for effective risk reduction interventions. This one is, I think, particularly important for a lot of these sort of conceptual models I've been presenting, where we say, well, what do we do next? How do we take this field forward? How do we get real purchase from it, impact? How do we make it effectful, rather than just a big sort of policy speak from the United Nations? And it says, what I'm suggesting is that when we put the two together, we open opportunities for understanding the problems we have within either one of them. So I would say disaster risk reduction is reaching a point where it's not moving fast enough in terms of the implementation strategies. Very good on the policy level. There'll be another global platform next year in May in Geneva and so forth. And this is all very fruitful and it's moving along, but what's life like, at the ground level? What's people's everyday existence really looking like? Has it changed that much? What are the transformational type of processes which are required to make the next steps? And maybe by looking at disaster and conflict risk reduction together, we can start to remove some of the blockages there are. Right, so the second section of this, therefore, is now just going to look at three different areas where I think there's already, in any case, a natural link between the two. In a few cases there are, it's been written about. So in the case of early warning is the first one of these. So just to remind you, it was in the summary, but the three are early warning. The second one is a rights-based approach, and the third one, resilience building, a theme you have been looking at quite a bit already. They overlap a bit, so I'll just talk a little bit about the early warning signals and communication. So with early warning systems, you can use any type of technology you want. It's sometimes a soft technology, sometimes hard technology. It's information. So you collect your data to warn off where the next impending sort of crisis is going to happen. But that's only a small part of it. Collecting the information is one bit. The larger sort of part of early warning really is about the communication process that has to take place. How do people hear the information? How do they understand it, believe it, interpret it, personalize it, confirm it, decide on how to respond? These days we tend to talk about early warning, early action, because early warning on its own is not going to be effective. So one thing we do know is that early warning is closely related to risk assessment, very closely. So you're assessing risks and then providing warnings about what's going to happen. With anything to do with risk in the future, human nature is usually not to prioritize it over something which is going to happen now, today, tomorrow. If you need food on the table for your children tomorrow morning, you're not as bothered about a possible drought which may be happening, say, 3 months' time. And we're all the same, pretty well. I know it for myself, something that's further away is less of a problem. So this is the perennial problem of risk management, is we're always dealing with sort of unknowns, and then it gets more complicated. We have known unknowns and unknown unknowns and so forth. So it gets a little bit complicated, and then we have to invoke things like a precautionary principle. The environmental managers will be familiar with that term, where you take the precautions even though you don't have the full evidence, because based on a risk assessment, because the impact and the damage, the effects are going to be very great, and if the likelihood of that rises, then there's a point at which decisions have to be made. But people in an everyday sort of situation are less likely to engage. So what we've learned is that you have to link early warning, risk management with people's immediate sense of well-being, and that's basically what this is saying. So by investing in improved well-being, you get motivated people, you get engaged people, and they will do risk reduction quite driven from their own energies and sort of understanding of the situation. So this is a sort of a simple sort of model, but it's always looks so simple when you put lines of boxes on slides. What does it really involve? There are a lot of complicating factors. This happens in the context of a culture of beliefs, ideas, values and knowledge which constitute the shared basis of social action. This is actually a sort of definition pretty well of culture. So cultural change has to happen, and there's many other factors there, some of which we've already alluded to earlier when we started introducing some of the entry points to doing this. So in the case of early warning, you can start to sort of see this happening. I think just in terms of trying to implement this sort of work, we found that it does work. It functions if you do this. So I've got now an example I've used quite a lot because this had quite a lot of impact and managed to sort of reduce disease epidemics in the central area of Mozambique. So this sort of approach of community engagement, sense of well-being, this is, excuse me, but I think I'm going to need a power source on this. It's about to. That's it. Yeah. So this is, but it can be tried and tested. This sort of approach of like linking risk assessments with implementational sort of strategies. So this is just a project in central Mozambique which does the risk assessment of a disease which keeps coming back each year. It was cholera and bacillary dysentery, the diarrheal diseases. And it's about people assessing risks using lots of different techniques, speaking to people who've got the disease, looking at the environment and mapping it. And then risk assessment, part of this process, becomes risk management. This was all done in the name of sort of like infectious disease early warning systems, which then became risk assessment, which then became community engagement, because that's the way it can be done most effectively. So the risk management of the disease starts to become through locally owned capacity building sort of strategies, and that is where we get to next. And risk assessment becomes risk management, but it happens in a context, and we call that, maybe someone knows what happens when you go from risk assessment to risk management. You can only do your management if you have the right type of risk governance. So a key area where you'll find practitioners and policy workers now trying to develop further is that of the risk governance. Because this project I'm talking about here, which is about assessing and then managing through local activities in the community, largely depends on the context with which it's going on. So we found that in one city it might function very well, but in another it might not, because the governance sort of weighting is different. Okay, so this immediately implies that for the case of early warning and risk management or risk assessment, we need to be thinking about inter-community relations, communication, need to be thinking about how local government operates, what are the barriers and obstacles to doing what you need to do. If people are going to try and reduce risks themselves from within their own structures, what are the obstacles to that happening? These sorts of questions come up. So this is why, just taking this one example of early warning systems and community engagement with early warning and risk assessment to risk manage to reduce risk and remove disease, we start to immediately get into the realms of some form of cooperation rather than conflictual sort of environment. Eventually, this is a long story which I don't have time to really relate, because I want to get my main points across. But in the long story of this particular example, there were many different, it was a multidisciplinary type of effort with lots of different people involved, including things like vaccine institutes, and very sort of top-down structured sort of approaches to try and resolve the problem. But at the end of the day, the most effective strategy of all was, in fact, to do with local governance and local sort of risk management solutions, and dealing with potential sort of conflicts of interest at the local level was the most effective strategy. And it didn't end there, because these are sort of cooperative groups working together who take over the process of managing the local area to make it more safe in terms of the infectious disease risks. And motivated individuals were at the center of a lot of this action. But in some other examples, there was conflict even within these sort of what we actually called risk and resilience committees years ago. There was conflict within those, and they didn't work. So you go back 2 years later and they wouldn't be there anymore. But in some cases you'd get the sustainability where it seemed to work quite well. So it boils down to those sorts of things. Right, okay. I'm afraid back to the nasty looking diagrams, and this one's particularly nasty, but it's nonetheless, it does demonstrate something. It shows that you've got the community involvement in early warning along one axis, and on the other one you've got appropriate development offsetting disaster risk. And this is one of the other areas I'm heading towards, is the idea you build up to offset. So this is a complex system, and it's just a representation, but the key thing to take out of it would be the green box there, is that you invest in the well-being. This is a version of resilience, if you like. You've been talking a lot about resilience. The one I'd like to promote is resilience as a form of well-being. You build up well-being, you become more resilient. Healthy people don't feel disasters in the same way as unhealthy people, for example. They can get out the way. Let's not get too sidetracked into another debate about resilience just now, but it's an important point to note that you can offset by building up. So you invest in these strategies and you get enhanced quality of life up the top there, and then all these things going on in your risk assessment, risk management, for early warning and so forth would then become a function of that rather than just an entity in itself. Right, that's risk governance, and I'm going to speed up a bit now, so if you don't mind, we'll just, this is for your reference later, it just shows a risk governance cycle, but most of the points have been made. There's a little bit more detail around the edges. So I'm going to move to the second now of the key ones, which I wanted to really flag as already existent in conflict contexts and in terms of disaster risk, other types of disasters. And deliberately not saying, well, I'm going conflict disasters and other types of disasters. Why? Because I don't want to get sort of dragged off into trying to define all the different types of disasters. That would take too long. But it does include, just to clarify, floods, cyclones, droughts, wildfire, hurricanes, landslides, earthquake. So, I'm not trying to avoid the problem of defining what is a disaster. I'm just preferring not to define it in that particular way. When we're talking about disaster and conflict risk reduction, I think we mean conflicts and all other types of disasters. Because so this rights-based approach, therefore, is another area where you can find the similarities or the equivalence in the two areas, and where they coincide in the same place and time, and where improved risk governance would actually make a big difference. Okay, so a rights-based approach to development has been around for a long time. You can find good literature on rights-based approaches. It's usually something to do with people knowing their rights and then trying to implement them. There are constitutions all over the world which look great on paper, but then are not adhered to. So one way is know your rights, and then you can try to implement those. This can be done at a very local level, where people don't even know what their rights are. They can't be implemented. So a rights-based approach to development, just one example by way of brevity, if you know what your land rights are, you're able to invest in food production more sustainably than if you don't know what your land rights are, and any moment a big producer can kick you off and make you more susceptible to food insecurity. Then that's an example where your rights are not being upheld, and it's actually creating a crisis situation, a food insecure situation. So the rights-based approach in development context is pretty well known about, and is only really in its infancy around disaster risk reduction. There's no legal framework for disaster risk reduction, really, from what we can see. There is global agreements, but there's no real legislation. So if I make you more exposed to disaster risk, there's no law that comes and says I can't do that. So we consequently, what you're seeing is risk transfer. So risks are being transferred from some people to other people. We've got disaster risk creation happening in some areas and disaster risk reduction happening in other areas, and there's no real legal framework to deal with that. We do have some minimum standards for emergency relief and disaster response, and that's based in humanitarian law, but we're a long way off the rights-based approach there. Now, in conflicts, there are laws. There's the international human rights sort of agreements. There's the International Criminal Court and so forth. Things do exist for conflict, and if we're saying these two areas are closely integrated and part of the same thing, then really we're going to have to make more progress on that. There is some work. There's a few groups around are looking at this just now, but it's in its infancy. So the future of disaster risk reduction rights sort of based approaches is one to look out for. It does link, of course, to something we've been mentioning already, governance, good risk governance. And this is where there has been quite a bit of work gone on over the years, different projects, and I know some of the projects done by this university, for example, have looked at some of these. What is the characteristics of good risk governance at, say, a local level? And when you put some of that together, you tend to get a list looking something like this, a sort of checklist. If you want good risk governance, then it's likely to include these features. That won't be a comprehensive list. There'll be other things that could be inserted. Okay, so without going into all the details, as I say, some of this can be gone back to later for reference. I'd like to move on to the third of the three common areas that we have. So resilience to disaster and resilience to conflict, it should really sort of be part and parcel of the same thing, particularly where it happens in areas which are experiencing both. There may be some differences in how you are resilient to, say, a drought or a flood, and how you are resilient to someone coming over the hill with a tank. But nonetheless, we can find some examples. There's just another resilience quote to add to your collection of resilience quotes. It really is fascinating, and I hope the discussion about resilience does carry on. But my point is to say, that conflict and disaster risk reduction do often happen in the same place with the same people. So we just take one quick example to make the point about resilience. The adaptive capacity of the pastoralists in southern Angola is something to behold. These are people that manage to look after large amounts of cattle. It's a sign of great wealth. About 100 head of cattle is the same as a sort of Toyota sort of Hilux or something like that, if it translates across into different sorts of economies in that region. And some of the largest land battles in recent history were in southern Angola. Some of the most extreme climatic situations have been there for thousands of years. People find little cracks in the rock over there with a bit of water, and they know where it is. It may be 400 kilometers that way, but they'll get there. And people move around, and they're extremely resilient, if you like, to use that term. They're strong. They're able to cope with that, both conflict and climate type of hazards. So during the Angolan War, some of the nomadic people in this region were the ones that actually managed to get out the way the most effectively. So I think that's what we mean by resilience in a sort of conflict. There may be some more learning to be had from that. I've put some notes here about the surrounding topology of this sort of resilience, and there's just some notes there, and to sort of try and go a bit further. And I'm just going to pick one out. This is sort of too much really to do every bit of this right now. I think some of it you'll recognize from things you've been working on, but this one here is really important to today's talk in particular, which is resilience is not an end in itself. People don't want to just survive, they want to thrive. This is the well-being agenda, which is completely different to just saying we're going to be strong and we're going to manage to get by. I know that many people using the resilience agenda are not actually saying that. Most would agree that it does aspire to bring sustainable development in one way or another. But I think we need to go a bit further and say, well, look, let's really make sure that what we mean is moving forward and improving life and livelihood and health, not just being resilient. So that was the point I wanted to make there, and I think this is something we can understand very well in situations of conflict risk reduction and disaster risk reduction. I think it's a richer terrain to be able to understand that perhaps than just saying disaster risk reduction. That's at least what I'm toying with, and I'm not claiming to have got particularly far, but I'm saying this is where we should be turning our attentions quite rapidly. Resilient to what? Environmental hazards, unsustainable development, social economic deprivation, political exploitation. All of this could be in one way or another to do with conflict. Communities and resilience building, we have the evidence. We know that where we get a pedagogy of community resilience, we deal with local conflict issues quite effectively. This is in northern Zimbabwe now, and excuse me for speeding up, I warned you I would do this. Beyond resilience, The well-being approach, becoming strong. This is now in Bangladesh, and this community here were largely displaced, marginalised, so-called sort of marginalised people living in shifting sands in the Meghna River, and then years later, through investing in environmental management, they're actually now living in quite a stable area, but they're very pleased about what's happened, but they don't just want to be resilient. They're saying, we've dealt with this. They were in a conflictual type of situation with other people who didn't really want them in their area, and they had to move as landless people to the most marginalised areas, and now they've become resilient, but they want schools, health posts. This is normal aspirations of all people. So building resilience is part of risk reduction, and you can do it through some of these things that are on that list there. And we know it happens because when we work with people and we observe this going on, we can see what works and what doesn't, and we know some of the principles for it working and some of the benefits. Low cost, adaptable, felt as effective within the community, a stimulus for wider risk reduction coordination. And I think when people say multi-hazard now, they mean we're working on the vulnerability side of disaster management, which means rather than just trying to avoid a hazard, you reduce vulnerability. As you reduce vulnerability to several different types of hazard, and there could be that opportunity for conflict risk reduction going on within that very strategy. So it's quite an exciting area. There's a lot to do. Now, I've run out of time, so what I'm going to do is just make my last 3 points in a sort of summative manner, which is the essence of what I wanted to say. I've covered the 3 areas, so there were basically early warning, early action to be more precise, a rights-based approach, and the sort of resilience building. Those 3 areas are areas which disaster risk reduction and conflict risk reduction sort of sit quite comfortably with, but when we integrate the 2, there's many more. We can start to get some ideas of where we could get more rapid, more effective, more cost-effective type of progress. What I want to end with really is the systematics going forward to try and do this better. And there's quite a lot of material that could be used to demonstrate this. But the systematics I want to flag are, there's a whole load of pictures, but don't worry, these are project pictures. It's all on here. So these basically are the 3 are like this. So some systematics for advancing disaster and conflict risk reduction are these. Now they are derived from the 3 things I've just mentioned, the early warning, early action, the rights-based approach, and the resilience. So as you work through those 3 areas and go into a bit more detail, then I think you start to find that what we really need to be doing is building up human well-being to offset disaster and conflict risk together. I think that point I've made quite strongly as we've gone along. The second one, which I would like to flag as well, is living with uncertain disaster and conflict risk. I think one of the limitations we've got is trying to always be able to predict what will happen next. I think we can better live with uncertain environments, and by that we already know that environmental systems are complex and uncertain. We can't predict exactly what will happen with our climate change in the future, but we've got a pretty good idea that it's going in a certain direction. So we live with uncertainty in any case at that level. But then when we talk about human behavior, we've got even more uncertainty. Why an entire community suddenly can start sort of behaving in a particular way is a sort of area of something like genocide studies or something like that. So there's extreme uncertain behavior, and there's certainly a lot of uncertain behavior over small everyday actions as to how you reduce conflict, how you invest in the more sustainable actions, and so forth. One of the points I've been saying a lot of my talks lately is that I think there's a lot more could be done by accepting the uncertainty and saying, well, look, we know we have an unknowing, and rather than trying to put something in the box to make it work, we start to say, well, there is an area where we can, if you like, put in some imagined variables, things like values, for example, that make it work, and see how that triggers change and difference. And that's the second area where I think combining the conflict and disaster risk reduction together is probably quite useful in dealing with this level of uncertainty. This is not the preserve of the social sciences and the anthropologists alone, or historians I should say as well. Like in mathematics, is there not some equations that you put an I in there to try and make it work? You have an imaginary I. Statisticians, they talk about information gap, and there are ways of looking at it. So whatever your particular preserve, there's something in this for you. So living with uncertainty is another quite exciting sort of proposition for this field. And then the last point on here is overcoming the barriers. So by identifying what the barriers to the changes are, I think we can do a lot more action. Now, the history of development has been doing development, whereas obviously that has not always worked. And we don't want to be saying the same thing about disaster risk reduction or conflict risk reduction in 10, 20 years' time as what we've had to say about development processes. So we need to be thinking a little bit smart here and say, look, if we learned from development studies that some of the most effective strategies were just to remove the barriers, allow people to formulate their own solutions, then I think probably we're starting to see the same things happening in terms of risk reduction strategies. It's about removing the obstacles. There's a long list of what they are. A lot of it's to do with comprehension, because risk is a difficult area. Okay, so I've provided some more slides here that I think, because I'm going to end because I'm out of time. But there are a few more slides where you can look at those 3 points on here, just some examples that should be very self-explanatory. They're very simple diagrams, but rather than just sort of flip over them like superficially, I think I prefer to just leave these 3 points pretty well hanging as they are. But you can find some examples of 1, 2, and 3 here to follow up on. Okay.